Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to start my day. And a lot of people are asking, what happened to the Jason Blaha fake sip investigator? Actually, I don't know. I didn't ban him or anything. The guy just disappeared. No conspiracies involved. I don't think anyone hurt him. He hasn't been banned. The guy just stopped posting. One of my more amusing trolls. But on to this topic. In the video I made yesterday discussing Scott Herman and the rack pulls and traps, invariably people always jump in and say, but Jason, don't farmers walks build traps? Don't strongmen have big traps because of all their weighted carries? And people come up with all these ideas, and it's just really bizarre that people don't put together two and two in their programming. Because I get a lot of people who are like, well, I did all these farmers walks and my traps started growing again. I noticed the only change I made to my training, and it's kind of like, so you're telling me for several months you didn't make any changes to your training? You use the exact same weight, the exact same reps on your rows, your overhead pressing, everything else? Guys say stuff like this, and look, I'm not going to deny that stretch overload can add some additional workload to a muscle, right? We know that it can. But if anyone out there thinks that stretch overload is going to be the primary mechanism by which you stimulate muscle growth, those muscles are going to be pretty small if that's what you're doing. Quite frankly, for traps, things like your overhead pressing and your rows, your standing presses and your rows, are going to be, for movements that most people do, those are going to be your primary trap developers. They actually work pretty good. If you get really strong at those two exercises, you're probably going to have decent sized traps. Now, deadlifts kind of come next behind that. I think those exercises build more trap than deadlifts do. If I just look at muscle activation on EMG, you look at biomechanics, yes, I think a deadlift is better than a rack pull for traps. I know people will be like, oh my God, how could you say that? Because it has to work harder. It's not that difficult of a concept, guys. Sorry about that, getting a little frog in my throat this morning. But let's talk about what's going on with strongmen and all of that. Now, a bunch of people say, Jason, you deadlift a lot. How come you don't have big traps? Guys, because I sit here and relax. All these guys who you see, who you think have these enormous traps, number one, these guys aren't that big. Number two, they probably sit there with their traps flexed. Yeah, I mean, if I flex my traps, of course they look really big. But you guys have seen me in a tank top photos and stuff I put up. I don't actually have small traps by any means. I don't care about my traps, though. Which, kind of brings us to a funny point. Why are all these guys obsessed with traps? People have noticed that, like the gym cell community, if you get Google that term, they seem to be really obsessed with traps. And I don't understand that either. And in the comments yesterday, there was a discussion, and it basically came down to these guys are obsessed with looking big in a shirt. That's usually what it comes down to, and traps are very noticeable. But the thing is, anyone who's big, who does basic compound movements, is going to have big traps anyways. In other words, if you gain enough muscle just doing your basic exercises to fill a shirt out, your traps are going to grow anyways. So let's talk about what's going on with people who maybe stimulate some extra growth from doing a stretch overload movement like farmer's walks or whatever. And let's talk about strongmen. This always comes up. People always say, well, what about strongmen? Doesn't that prove this? It's like, well, then all strongmen should have enormous 25-inch biceps also, because all these stretch overload movements for the traps put a stretch overload on the biceps. And yes, we know that it stretches the biceps just as hard. Again, plenty of data on that. You should be able to look at what's going on and realize the biceps get worked just as hard as the traps do as far as stretching, as a stretch overload there. Absolutely, but you've got to remember, beyond a certain threshold, adding more weight to a stretch overload on something that has a fixed distance it can travel isn't going to increase activation in the muscle. And that's a point that people fail to see. In other words, if hanging 500 pounds is enough to pull your bicep all the way down, pull your scapula all the way down to the traps and everything are stretched, putting another 500 pounds on it is not necessarily going to add any more muscle activation to those muscles. And that's what people forget with this stuff. But it's about having a certain amount of volume there, a volume of work. But stop and look at strongmen. Everyone uses a strongman example for weighted stretching to develop traps, and it's like, guys, I want you to really think about this. What other things do strongmen do? Every single strongman who competes, unless they're at the very bottom of the list, like if they're placing last at a strongman event, I get it. You have to be really, really, really strong at standing overhead pressing. Standing overhead presses light your upper traps up. All right, you should be able to look at basic biomechanics involved, and you should go look at both EMG studies. And if you look at EMG studies, it becomes very, very apparent that the upper traps get enormous stimulation from overhead pressing, particularly standing. Enormous stimulation, almost as high as a shrug does. Like a heavy shrug. I don't mean a 100-pound shrug. I'm talking heavy, heavy work. It gets pretty close. I mean, shrugs beat it, but overhead pressing is pretty high on the list. All of these strongmen do tons and tons of overhead pressing. In fact, they have to compete at it. They have to be strong at it. Well, that alone would give them big traps. That by itself. I'm sorry, but anyone who can strict standing press 300 plus pounds will have enormous traps if they did no other exercise. I want people to think about that. If all you did was overhead press all day long, and that was the one lift you did and you did nothing else, or you cleaned and pressed, because that's what they have to do. They have to clean and press a log in competition. If you did nothing but clean and press as the only exercise that you did day in, day out, and did nothing else in the gym, you would have big traps if you got really, really strong on it. Like if you spent 4 or 5 years mastering that lift till you got brutally strong on it, your traps would be massive. Number 2, they all do rows. Rows are up there easily in the top 5 for exercises that stimulate trap growth, particularly the middle part of the traps, right? They're utilized heavily in any sort of rowing. They all do rows. Oh, and incidentally, they all do deadlifts. Deadlifting, they have to compete at. They have the car deadlifts and stuff. That's part of their sport. So for people to stand there and claim that the farmer's walks are responsible for their enormous traps, it's the farmer's walks. It's not all these other lifts that we know use the traps more than a weighted stretch can. No, it must be the weighted stretches, right? Also, I'm going to kind of point out that most strong men use drugs. They use PEDs. Which muscles in the body respond the most to anabolics? Upper chest, delts, and traps. They have the highest response. They have the most androgen receptors. In other words, those muscles will see, on a dose-dependent relationship, will usually see a little more muscle growth than other muscles. So you have 3 other exercises these guys do that all are enormous trap stimulators, 2 of which they have to do in competition usually, and most of them use anabolics. And people want to claim it's this one other factor that gave them big traps. I'm sure it helps, but it's not even close to their primary stimulator of trap growth. I mean, again, you go back to the clean and the press that they have to do. That alone, if you were to get strong enough to clean and press 300 pounds, which if that's all you focused on, you could do. If you didn't waste your time recovering from other lifts and you did that 4, 5, 6 days a week, you could get to 300 pounds. You'd have big traps. So what I'm suggesting here is that there's other factors at play. The same thing when we come over to people who say, well, I started adding them in and my traps started growing again. Well, did you measure that? Are you sure of it? Let's assume that they actually measured it and there's anecdote involved. Well, maybe you just weren't working hard enough on the other lifts. In other words, maybe a person who saw their traps start growing from that wasn't doing enough volume on their overhead press and they weren't doing enough volume on their rows. Because if you were, your traps would already be growing. So what happens when we're dealing with a muscle? If we have any muscle in the body that doesn't reach its minimum effective volume to stimulate growth, because it's already big enough and strong enough to handle the workloads it's being subjected to, what happens if you add another exercise that maybe isn't as good as the main ones you're doing, but you get the extra training volume in that you were missing? Well, that muscle will usually start growing again because now you've reached your minimum threshold to stimulate new growth. But you would have seen the same growth had you started doing more rowing and overhead pressing. If you added 4 or 5 more sets of those each week, your traps would have probably started growing also. If you have a muscle like the traps, which isn't growing at all, that's probably an indication that you're not doing enough work for it. And just because you add in another exercise that suddenly pushes you to the minimum effective volume you needed to start growing, it doesn't mean that that exercise is better than or even equal to the ones you were already doing. And the other thing I point out with a lot of these guys, they'll say that, well, I added this in, and it's like, well, let's see your training logs. You're telling me that you didn't do anything extra? You're telling me that your overhead press was at 185 for 5 by 5 once a week and you didn't add a single rep? You didn't add a single pound over the several months you did the farmer's walks? That you were rowing, whatever, 225 for 3 sets of 8 twice a week. You didn't add any weight to that? You didn't increase the reps? How terrible was your training that you went months without increasing your basic lifts? That doesn't even sound right. Like, what's wrong with your training? If that's how bad your training is, if the only change you made was adding farmer's walks, then guess what? I think I know what your problem is. Your training sucked. And when you added more volume in, because you don't know how to program or train apparently, you added a little more volume in for something else, you started seeing some growth. But, you probably should be working on improving your other lifts, because again, if you go several months with no changes in your program and you're not a very advanced lifter already, there's something wrong. So you got to wonder where people come up with these antidotes. They're not thinking it through in the context of their overall training. Just like when they look at what certain people do, aha, they're doing this and that must be why they have this result. No, it's the totality of what they're doing. You better look at everything that they're doing. You better look at everything that they're doing. Because people will do that. They will try to say this one exercise that this person is doing that might be a little different is the magical reason for their results. Like Eric Soto, they're like, oh, the Soto press. Or you think the Soto press is the reason he got to a 700 plus pound bench. Do you really think that's the reason? I'm going to say he did a lot of really heavy benching. Also probably helped a lot too. Just throwing that in there. I'm pretty sure his bench press contributed a lot to his bench press also. Just throwing that out there. But people don't want to look at the obvious. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative. And I will talk to you guys next time.